Ladies and gentlemen, we have some new conservative on conservative violence that I have to share with you. So Mediaite tweeted, Ben Shapiro slams Tucker Carlson for monologue on populism. He sounds more like Bernie Sanders than Milton Friedman. Oh, I'm going to love this so much. Let them fight. Let them fight. Go at it, y'all. Go at it. So, before we get into the specifics of this, understand the different strains of conservatism that they represent. Now, Ben Shapiro believes in free market, unfettered, laissez-faire capitalism. And doesn't hide it, doesn't dance around it, lays it all out there, and has argued for it repeatedly and vociferously. That's his philosophy. Now, he believes in that, plus he's a neocon. He is consistently hawkish. And so overall, you could say he's a movement conservative. That's the ideology and philosophy that best explains him and represents him, where he lies on the political spectrum. So, as a movement conservative, he has a lot more in common with George W. Bush and Ted Cruz than he does with Donald Trump, for example, or Pat Buchanan. Now, Tucker Carlson comes from the paleoconservative school of thought. Now, I would argue that a guy like Trump is more... There's not a real philosophy that underlies what Donald Trump is doing. I think he's very erratic. I think he's not consistent. I think the policies he's pursued prove that. But to the extent we can ascertain, at least from Trump's rhetoric, where he lies, he's somewhat paleoconservative. So he's kind of half in the George W. Bush camp and Ted Cruz camp and half in the Pat Buchanan camp. Now, what separates a guy like Pat Buchanan and half of Donald Trump from the Ted Cruzes and the George W. Bushes and the movement conservatives is that at least in rhetoric, in theory, they're more non-interventionist. So they don't support every war, no questions asked, like the neocons do. And also, they're willing to do some level of regulation of the capitalist marketplace and protectionism to try to look out for the American worker. Now, listen, for a lot of this stuff, the devil's in the details. And like, what kind of protectionism are you doing? What kind of regulation of the marketplace are you doing? Because that matters. It's not like by definition every protectionist policy is right. That's not true. But having said that, I'm personally a lot more sympathetic to actual paleocons than I am to neocons. In the same way that I'm more sympathetic to libertarians than I am to neocons. Because when you look at neocons and movement conservatives, in my opinion, like, I disagree with them on basically everything. Like, I think they're wrong on pretty much everything. Whereas with the paleocons, at least in theory, there's some points of connection. Foreign policy, we agree more. Some regulation of the marketplace, we agree more. Well, so in this fight, I've already, kind of let the cat out of the bag as far as who I'm more inclined to agree with, but let's go through what's presented here in the Mediaite article. So Tucker on his show said the following, quote, "Does anyone still believe that cheaper iPhones or more Amazon deliveries of plastic garbage from China are going to make us happy? They haven't so far. A lot of Americans are drowning in stuff, and yet drug addiction and suicide are depopulating parts of the country. Anyone who thinks the health of a country can be summed up in GDP is an idiot." He continued, "We do not exist to serve markets, just the opposite. Any economic system that weakens and destroys families is not worth having. A system like that is the enemy of a healthy society." So, parts of that I totally agree with, but then there are tiny parts where I think it's overstated and I don't totally agree. So the parts that I agree, anyone who thinks the health of a country can be summed up by GDP is an idiot. So true, and I don't think I've ever heard that from a conservative. So credit to Tucker for that specific point. And the idea that we do not exist to serve markets, just the opposite. Any economic system that weakens and destroys families is not worth having. A system like that is the enemy of a healthy society. I totally agree with that, and I'd actually go a step further than what Shapiro said about that. That doesn't even just sound like Bernie Sanders. That actually goes beyond Bernie Sanders. That sounds more like Noam Chomsky. We do not exist to serve markets, just the opposite. So they exist to serve us. So if they're no longer serving their function as creating a healthy society and a happy society, then what the fuck's the point? Then perhaps a market society is not the way to go. Good-ass point. Now, the part of, and perhaps I'm nitpicking here, but the disagreement I have with Tucker is when he says, does anyone still believe the cheaper iPhones or more Amazon deliveries of plastic garbage from China are going to make us happy? They haven't so far. A lot of Americans are drowning in stuff, and yet drug addiction and suicide are depopulating parts of the country. To me, that's too strong of an argument against material goods. And there's a little bit of a causation-correlation problem there where he's saying, well, obviously material goods are not making us happy because we have, sky-high levels of depression, but we also have a historic level of stuff. So the stuff is not what's going to make us happy. I think that's a little misleading because if you go through who are the most depressed in society and who are the ones who are hurting the most, some of it can be tied back to material well-being. But he kind of flippantly states like iPhones and plastic garbage from China. Yeah, no, I agree that those particular kinds of stuff are not the things that are going to make you happy necessarily, although an iPhone helps. But, having a piece of the pie, having material well-being, having a house, perhaps a white picket fence if you're so inclined to get something like that, being able to own something and call it yours and work towards the well-being of your family and yourself and create a brighter future, having hope for a brighter future. Now, a brighter future is not only tied to material well-being. I agree with him on that, but I think he downplays material well-being too much as if it doesn't matter when it, in fact, does matter. So that's my slight disagreement with him. I think it's too flippant to describe, like, material well-being and economic security as cheaper iPhones and plastic garbage from China. Like, no, material well-being is also like, can you afford your fucking mortgage? Can you afford a car to get to your job? Stuff like that. Can you pay off your fucking student loan debts? Shit like that. So I largely agree with what Tucker said, but I think he goes a little too far in the anti-materialism stuff. Any society that's functioning in a healthy, prosperous way is going to have a level of material well-being and economic security, and it's not going to be like just hippy-dippy, oh, consumerism is bad, bro. Like that, I think, goes too far. Okay. But having said that, the sentiment behind what Tucker's saying, I'm with him. Now, let's get into some of Ben Shapiro's response. So this is from Mediaite. Quote, Carlson explicitly states, along with Sanders and Warren, that voluntary decisions can amount to exploitation. He blames rich Americans for somehow, in an unspecified fashion, convincing poor Americans to conceive children out of wedlock. Shapiro writes, adding that the root problem with the country is the increasing lack of virtue and moral principles, not prosperity, which is rather an effect. Free market-induced innovation led to higher life expectancies and more prosperity, adding that it is human mistakes, not the existence of the free market, that causes lack of prosperity. Quote, I really think that Tucker is wrong on a lot of this, but I think that the economic populism he's espousing is becoming increasingly popular in a Republican Party that has forgotten a lot of its free market capitalistic roots and is ignoring the benefits of the free market in favor of government intervention. All right, let's break this down. To that last point, Benny boy, you got nothing to worry about. The Republican Party ain't budging an inch, bitch. You want to know why? Because they're bought and owned by the status quo, the corporations, the establishment, the elites. So the idea that, like, Republicans are somehow, like, as a party, they're all moving towards more government intervention, utter nonsense. The only kind of government intervention they support is socialism for the rich. So corporatism, propping up the existing corporations and the existing status quo. Wall Street bailouts, for example. Corporate welfare to ExxonMobil, $4 billion a year so they could do research and development, which is just a ruse. It's a bribery scheme. The lobbyists from ExxonMobil pay off the government. The government props them up and gives them money, which is just hosing the taxpayers. That's the only kind of like real government intervention the Republican Party supports. Now, Trump has some deviations from that with some tweaks and protectionism here and there. But the Republican Party, by and large, no. Ben, they are 100% in agreement with your philosophy of more laissez-faire free market capitalism. And by the way, Tucker Carlson, despite his populist rhetoric on this stuff, he's a supporter of Donald Trump. Donald Trump just did his Republican tax bill. That tax bill is Ben Shapiro's wet dream. That tax bill is 83% of the benefits go to the top 1% over a decade, and you cut the corporate tax rate massively, you cut the estate tax massively. It was like Wall Street's wet dream and the billionaires' wet dream. That was exactly what the uber capitalist obsessed class wanted implemented. So even Tucker, who's giving populist rhetoric, functionally ends up supporting these capitalist reforms, these right-wing reforms, trickle-down economics, supply-side economics. So not only are you wrong that the Republican Party, the elected Republicans are moving towards more government intervention, not only are you wrong about that, even the person you're arguing with, Tucker Carlson, effectively ends up supporting the same policies that you espouse. His rhetoric might be more populist, I agree on that, but in terms of who he ends up supporting, which politicians, Tucker ain't out there arguing for Bernie Sanders to get elected, and nor is he going to. So it's just... Functionally, we're dealing with people who support the same shit here. Just there's only differences in rhetoric. But definitely not the elected Republicans fucking moving towards more government intervention. As right now, they're trying to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid right now. So this idea of here they go. The Republicans are moving towards populism. Oh, please. I wish we had a Republican Party that came out and said, okay, you know what we're on board with now? Medicare for all. Because 70% of the country wants it, even a majority of our voters want it, Republican voters. So that's what we're for. I wish! Not happening. Okay, that's the first point. Now, the rest of this, honestly, it shows how intellectually bankrupt Ben Shapiro is, in my opinion. I mean, he is so overrated. All he does is talk fast and give just the his beliefs and Ted Cruz's beliefs, they line up 97%. And we all know Ted Cruz is a douche. Not just because of how he rubs you the wrong way from personality traits. I mean, that's part of it, but also just because his ideas are shitty. Ben Shapiro just dresses up all of Ted Cruz's ideas and talks fast and makes you think he's super smart. But really, I think he's intellectually bankrupt. He's just a Republican yes man. That's what he is. And, okay, here are the worst parts of what I just went through with you. He claims that, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Tucker Carlson, they think voluntary decisions can amount to exploitation. First of all, the framing on that is massively misleading. It's very loaded the way he crafted that argument, and I think it's misleading on purpose. But second of all, is it really your contention that there's no such thing as a voluntary decision that can amount to exploitation? Here's an idea. Here's just one example. I could give a million examples. There was a time in American history called the Lochner era, where where the Supreme Court decided that you have a right to contract as an American. So what that means is the federal government has no right at all to get in between you and your employer, or an employer and their employee. And so what that means is no regulations, no rules. Hey, freedom, man. So freedom for a guy to go to his employer and say, can I work for you? Yes. Hey, what are the terms? Well, the employer, I need somebody who's going to work 80 hours a week. So you're going to work 80 hours a week for me, and I'm going to pay you this terrible low wage. Well, under this philosophy of voluntary decisions can amount to exploitation, which is what he believes, that guy who had no options, okay, He's taking the least bad option of you're going to work for me, you're going to work 80 hours a week, and you're going to work for shitty pay. Ben Shapiro says, hey, man, that freedom. You actively chose that road, so you can't complain. And a voluntary decision can never be exploitation, really. So it's not exploitation if you work 80 hours a week and you're getting paid a shitty wage. The Lochner case, so the government had to step in. I think the guy sued and then went to the Supreme Court. And the decision from the Supreme Court was the government has no right to step in and say, okay, the law is if you work more than 50 hours a week, you have to get overtime pay. So that's a reasonable rule. Most people would agree. That's a regulation that they can get behind. You know, hey, if you work more than X amount, that's overdoing it. So we're going to make it so that you have to get paid time and a half. Or just basic minimum wage laws. There was a time when the Supreme Court ruled minimum wage laws are unconstitutional because the government has no right to get in between an employer and an employee. So if they tell you, I'm going to pay you $2 an hour, you have to accept it. You can't say, the government can't say, no, minimum that you could pay the person is $7.25. According to Ben Shapiro's philosophy, this is where his principle leads the economy. It leads the economy with corporate overlords determining every single aspect of your life. And you have no right to fight back. Child labor laws. That is literally an example. Hey, the kid agreed. The kid agreed. What do you want me to tell you? His family needed food. They needed food. So he has no choice. He's going to come work for me, and I'm going to pay him, and then at least him and his family can eat. It's a voluntary decision. So why would you? It's a voluntary. What's the problem? He literally agreed to it. I don't see what the problem is. This is Ben Shapiro's fucking idea. Now, he may or may not know that this is the impact of his ideology implemented, but if he doesn't know it, well, now I'm explaining it to him, and if he doesn't get it after this, he's just being purposefully dense to try to hold on to his ideal, which in fact, applied in reality, is fucking stupid, incredibly immoral, and ends up hurting a tremendous number of people. And Tucker Carlson, at least smart enough to know that in rhetoric, he shouldn't be against regular working people. He should probably be for child labor laws, probably be for a decent minimum wage. But Ben Shapiro is too married. He's an ideologue. He's too married to the idea of free market, unfettered, laissez-faire capitalism that the markets are the gods. You cannot tweak them under any circumstance. Quote, Tucker thinks voluntary decisions can amount to exploitation. Oh, yes, how silly of him to think that there's exploitation even in nominally voluntary relationships. Fucking so stupid. If you think about it for 2 seconds, Ben Shapiro's point is obviously dumb. Okay, then here's another one of the dumber points that he made. Shapiro says, the root of the problem in the country is the increasing lack of virtue and moral principles. The increasing lack of virtue and moral principles. Now, I hope that's not code speak for people just aren't religious enough anymore. That might be what it's code speak for. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there because that was one of the first things that popped in my mind. Lack of virtue and moral principles. In other words, you guys got to be more religious. What are you doing? By the way, only like 20% of the country describe themselves as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, which is just not part of any religion. They could be atheist, agnostic, deist, just not part of a religion. Only 20% of the country. So most of the country is religious. So if that's his argument, oh my God, lack of virtue and moral principles, you're not religious enough. I think that's stupid on its face, but also it's just not true because the country is still religious overall in terms of the people. But a different interpretation of that is not even related to religion. It's just, personal responsibility. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's not that the economy is broken and you don't get rewarded for acting like a good citizen. That's not what the problem is. The problem is you personally, your lack of virtue and your lack of moral principles. You're not a good person. So, of course, we're not going to have a good society because you're personally not a good person. So, what the fuck do you expect? That's the argument. So, blame voters. Blame the average citizen for any problem. It's not that you live in a fucking perennially and perpetually corrupt system bought by corporations and elitists and billionaires. That's not the problem. The problem is not corruption. The problem is not that a political science studied, a Princeton study showed that our country is functionally an oligarchy. There's no correlation between what your average American wants and what the policy we end up getting is. The problem is not that your politicians ignore your will at every turn. No, the problem is your lack of virtue and moral principles. So average person shaming. That's what Ben Shapiro is doing, just shaming the average person. Ben, that's so dumb, I don't even know why I'm bothering to comment on it. I mean, for fuck's sake, half of workers in this country make $30,000 a year or less. Are they just not trying hard enough, Ben? Is it lack of virtue and moral principles? Is that what it is? 76% of the country lives paycheck to paycheck. Seems to me like maybe it's an economic, systemic problem, and it's not an individual moral failing. I mean, 30,000 to 45,000 people dying because they don't have access to basic health care? Is that a personal moral failing? Sorry, you had cancer, and now you're going to go bankrupt because you can't afford it. God, that's a personal moral failing. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This is the ideology. It's callous, it's disconnected from reality, and it's dumb. And then finally, this will be the last point here. He says, free market-induced innovation led to higher life expectancies and more prosperity, adding that it is human mistakes, not the existence of the free market, that causes lack of prosperity. So this is interesting because here the game is rigged. So it's like the capitalism of the gaps argument. So whenever anything good happens in a society that's some percentage capitalist, the good stuff is, the capitalism gets credit for the good stuff. So he's working backwards from his conclusion. His conclusion is capitalism is awesome, and then he connects the dots by saying, hey, free markets have led to higher life expectancies and more prosperity, so there's a causation correlation issue. It has to be the capitalism because we're to some extent a capitalist society, and there's a higher life expectancy and a solid level of innovation. Now, notice he never does it in the opposite direction. It's easy to do it in the opposite direction. A lot of the funding that went to NASA, the government, led to the technologies that were breakthroughs for the economy that led to tremendous wealth creation and an increase in self-reported happiness, an increase in quality of life. That's the term I was looking for. That's the phrase I was looking for. So because of the NASA funding, we have a lot of technologies now that are awesome that increase quality of life. Therefore, the NASA funding, that was government. So government increased your quality of life. And we could do this all day long. And the clearest example where he usually does this is Scandinavia. What does he do with Scandinavia? Well, I mean, the reason why they do so well on every single objective empirical study and measure of how they're doing is because they're still, in parts, nominally, a capitalist economy and society. So even though they are way more social democratic than we are here, way more social democratic, and their quality of life is better, they self-report higher levels of happiness, they have a stronger middle class, they have better healthcare systems, more vacation times. Even though they're more social democratic, he ignores the fact that they're more social democratic and therefore more socialist, and still gives credit to the capitalism part. Again, because he's working backwards from his conclusion. So the game is rigged. So, I mean, you can't take what he's saying here seriously, because he will always, anything positive, he will always immediately give credit to capitalism for it. And by the way, he does, when it comes to Marxism, notice what he does. He flips it. So anything bad that ever happened ever, well, obviously it's Marxism. Does Ben Shapiro ever say, hey man, how many millions of people has the U.S. killed? When you look at everything post-World War II, how many people died in Vietnam? How many people died in South America? How many people died in the Middle East? A minimum 200,000 in Iraq, minimum 1 million in Vietnam, and we're just getting started. Again, we overthrew democratic governments in South America. We overthrew the democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, in Iran in 1953. How many millions of lives have been taken by the U.S. government, okay, by the United States of America? Does he ever say, well, obviously we are mostly a capitalist system here in the U.S., so blame capitalism for those deaths? A lot of those Wars were to take natural resources. A lot of those wars were to maintain our geopolitical dominance and be the world's sole superpower. So obviously, that's capitalism's fault. We have to get past capitalism because capitalism is to blame for that. We're mostly a capitalist society, and we killed all these people around the world. See, he never does that, but he's willing to do it the other way. He's willing to say, oh my God, you had a leftist government, and then people died, so you got to blame leftism for that, right? Oh, anything good happened anywhere? Definitely not. Credit to social democracy, to government. In any instance, it's all because of the capitalism. He's working backwards. Guys, he's a hack. He's a fucking hack. It's so obvious. Now, I'm no fan of Tucker Carlson. We have tiny points of agreement, but overall, I think me and him would disagree on 80 to 85% of the issues. But on this front, it's not even close. It's not even close. Ben Shapiro is dead wrong and comically so, and I cannot wait for the idiots in movement conservatism to go into the dustbin of history. Because the neocons and the movement conservatives, nobody has ever been more wrong and has ever crafted arguments that are laying on a fucking feeble bed of quicksand more than them. They don't have a goddamn leg to stand on, and it's obvious. So bring in the libertarian conservatives. They're more reasonable because on about 40% of stuff, I tend to agree with them. And bring in the paleo conservatives because I disagree with them more than I disagree with the libertarians. But hey, at least there's some points of agreement. Where there are no points of agreement, George W. Bush, Ted Cruz, and Ben Shapiro and their ilk of dumbass conservative.